Okay, thanks so much, Anne. It's very exciting to have Anne chairing my session. She's a hero of mine. So I want to thank IAP2 for having me here. I'd also like to thank Open State. I've been working with Gail and her team on another workshop in Open State called Beyond the Vote, which is about democratic innovation. That's next week, and some other events. So that's been quite exciting. Today I'm going to be talking about the impacts of engagement, and I'm going to introduce a couple of cases. But I'm going to be particularly focusing on the implications for practice. So this is definitely about power, but I'm also going to be talking a lot about practice. So I will just describe those cases, tell you some things about impacts that I've learnt, and also then make some suggestions about how we can approach our practice slightly differently. And I'd like to also thank Simon for his talk this morning, because I think some of the things I'm going to suggest might be ways that can help us to think about the challenges that he raised. I hope that's the case. And I'm going to try and be quick enough to leave time for some discussion. There's some important issues to raise. Okay, so the first case I'm going to be talking about is some research that I'm doing at the moment. This is the one funded by New Democracy Foundation, and it's on the impacts of deliberative processes in Australia. And I've basically taken some case studies, which are mostly citizens' juries, or also the Citizens' Parliament that was held in 2009, the citizens' juries in South Australia, and the People's Panel in the City of Melbourne ran. Those are my main cases. And I'm the chief investigator on that project, and I've got John Dryzek and Gail Fairlam as advisors to the project. I'm also going to talk about some earlier work I did when I worked with the department, the Commonwealth Department of Innovation. I say etc. because it kept changing its name, so the innovation bit stayed pretty much the same. And I worked within the department on a program called STEP, which is Science and Technology Engagement Pathways. So this is a framework that we co-designed with various groups. And then we implemented the framework in a series of engagements called Step into the Future. And I'm going to talk about one of those, which was about nanotechnology and informed choice. Okay, but as I said, I want to talk about the implications of this work for our practice. We're here as practitioners. And so we know that impact is a really important part of engagement practice, but impact happens in a larger context, and this is what makes it difficult. So I'm going to be talking about that context, and the first thing to note, and Anne's raised this and other people have as well, that context is changing and it's probably becoming more complex. So we have this situation that my colleagues at the University of Canberra call an era of communicative plenty, also known as communication overload, where we have a whole lot of new channels of communication. These raise a whole lot of opportunities for engagement, but also challenges. We also have a whole range of wicked problems, and the thing about these problems is not that they're complex and uncertain, they certainly are, but that we don't necessarily agree what the problem is or what's causing it. So we really need engagement to make any progress on these problems, but of course they're very complex and difficult. We also have complex governance arrangements, partly with globalisation. We've got a lot of governance that spreads beyond national borders, but even within nation states, as Simon alluded to, we've got very complex governance arrangements, so what decision-making looks like is becoming more complex. And again, that creates both a need for more engagement, but also challenges for engagement. And in that changing context, there have been more calls for an improvement in engagement practice and some calls for best practice in engagement to help us with these challenges. And I'm going to talk a bit about best practice because our framework that we were developing was a best practice framework, and I came to think quite critically about this idea of best practice. And a definition of best practice is commercial or professional procedures or methods that are accepted or prescribed as being correct or most effective. Maybe start to see some of the difficulties with best practice already. So this is where we've got methods, and we know that if we apply them, we get a desired kind of result. That's best practice. So what's a best practice approach to engagement? Well, best practice, you won't find, IAP don't have best practice guidelines. We've got core values. And already if you look at the way the core values are described, it's pretty clear that this is not a sort of prescribed approach. These are aspirational kind of goals that we have. But we also see that These are things we aspire to, but they're not things that we are completely in control of. So some of them, communicating to participants how their input affected the decision, we can hope to have control of that one, but even providing information, meaningful information, that's not always in our hands. Even seeking input from participants in design is not always in our hands. And when we come to the one that I'm most interested in, sorry, I'm going out of order, which is number 2, includes the promise that the public's contribution will influence the decision. Okay, again, aspirational, but how much control do we really have on that one? And so I've raised this provocative question, which is, if we do engagement that doesn't have much impact, has low impact or no impact, does this mean that it's bad practice? Or does it mean that there are factors that we don't have control of that made it not work? Or have we made the wrong choice about the engagement that we embarked on? And I'm going to use these questions to kind of frame the discussion. The first thing I want you to draw your attention to is that we talk about engagement and we talk about engagement practice, but we are not the ones who do the engagement. Engagement practice is where we design, we facilitate, we mediate, we evaluate engagement that other people do. And it's the engagement that has the impact. So we're already a bit removed. Okay, I think that's a really important thing for us to recognise, and particularly in relation to best practice. So let's think about impact and let's talk about context. So we can, as Simon said this morning, we can separate the context into the public sphere. So this is the general publics, but also this includes the media, this includes various kind of interest groups, this includes public protest, this even includes some companies when they interact with the political system. And then we've got the empowered sphere. I'm calling them spheres here, but it's synonymous with Simon's space. And the empowered sphere is where we have people who are empowered to make political decisions. Oops, that's better. Okay, so when we think about impact, then we need to think about these different parts of the context. And the most notable and measurable impacts that our engagement has is on the participants of the engagement. And we know that I've been working in the area of deliberative democracy, and the impacts here are really impressive. And these include shifts in people's thinking. So the information that's provided and the chance to hear from other views generally cause shifts in thinking. Even if people don't change their minds, their thinking becomes more informed, generally more sophisticated. Also, they build various types of capacity and also political engagement, which often is sustained beyond whatever event they're involved in, again, particularly in deliberative kind of models. And in this sense, they can take on new roles as advocates for this type of process, or as advocates on the issue, or even for government. But what we're often really looking for is impact in the empowered sphere. We want impact on political decision-making. And there are a range of impacts that engagement can have on the empowered sphere, and policy-making is only one of these. And the uptake of the recommendations of a citizen process is only one impact, potential impact on policy making. I think it's really important that we recognise that we can have multiple impacts. Some of them are indirect and some of them are very difficult to measure, but they're nonetheless important in the long term. So for policy making, we can actually have recommendations taken up, but we could also just have the policy making process, the debate leading into it being influenced by what's happened in the engagement. And we can also have just the general opinions of politicians and bureaucrats, and the things that make it onto the agenda can be influenced by these sort of processes. We don't see that much of that agenda setting, because often the processes that we run are ones that have been on the agenda and often already quite advanced. But in the science and technology area, we've seen some good examples of agenda setting influence. The implementation of policy can be influenced by engagement. So the way that, not only the way that policy is communicated, but also how it's implemented in instruments or initiatives or programs, and how it's delivered to communities can be strongly influenced by engagement. And the empowered sphere can also learn from engagement. And Simon talked about deliberative quality. What the hope is that the deliberative quality of debate within the empowered sphere might be influenced by higher deliberative quality in engagement. But also, we mustn't forget that we have impact also in the public sphere, and that this can potentially also influence the empowered sphere. So the first type is simply the impact that we have on public debate, and public debate is extremely important in engagement. Sometimes we think that engagements can replace debate in the mass public, but I think that's a very dangerous kind of idea to turn our back on public debate. And the public sphere can be impacted also through the media and stakeholders. And through this My Impact project, I've developed a new little space in this diagram, which is what I call the influential orbit. Obviously not a sphere, but an orbit. And this is really important, particularly at higher levels of government. And this includes the media and stakeholders broadly defined, so lobby groups, for example, some experts. So these are the people who are closest to government, who have a disproportionate influence on government decisions. And this sphere is very important in terms of transmission between the public sphere and the empowered sphere, and also sometimes in blocking between the two. And so impacts that engagement has on this sphere are quite important. I call these mediating impacts. And, you know, as I said, sometimes these the influential orbit can block some of this, the transmission, but sometimes they can also help. And so there's interesting examples in my project where media can help to transmit messages from engagement to the public sphere, and also where stakeholders can be influenced by engagement to take a different position or to behave differently with respect to an issue or a political debate. And I think that's very interesting. And actually, what I'm arguing is that particularly citizens' juries and processes, deliberative processes of that kind, are actually an example of where some citizens have been brought into the influential orbit and have more access to government. But once they do that, then they jostle with the other players who are in that orbit, and there's potential for kind of power shifts there, which I think are fascinating. Okay. So I'm going to now introduce my case studies to look at some of these impacts. And the first one is one of the South Australian citizens' juries, and this was one about bicycles and cars sharing the road safely. This was held in 2014 and 15, and it was run by the Department of Premier and Cabinet, so Gail's team. There was a randomly selected jury of exactly 37 citizens from Adelaide. And importantly, there was also a core reference group that had key stakeholders, including the bike lobby groups, the Automobile Association, the regulator, and several government agencies, and some others. And they played a very important role and an interesting role in this process. Emily Jenke ran and facilitated the process, and New Democracy recruited the citizens. And a result, fairly direct result of this, was that there were changes to the road rules, which meant that cars now have to be a mandatory 1 metre away from bicycles on the road in South Australia, and also bicycles are allowed to travel on footpaths now. And those were recommendations from the jury. I'm not going to debate those. So to think about impact, the engagement went really well. The participants were really happy with how it went, and they were very engaged and very excited about it, and they learnt a lot as well. The impact on the stakeholders was interesting. So there were these key stakeholders in the core reference group, and they were also very favourable about the process. And one of the really interesting results was that in a couple of cases of South Australian citizens' juries, there were stakeholder groups who didn't get the result they wanted, but explicitly said that they were going to work with the result that came out, pretty much as a result of having been involved in that engagement process in the citizens' jury, which is interesting. It's the first time I've seen that. And yeah, the impact was quite strong in terms of political decisions. There was policy that came out of it that you can directly link. And as well as the new road rules, there are other programs and initiatives which involved various agencies, health and transport and so on. And so there was quite a lot of impact across those different agencies, and that was made possible by the Department of Premier and Cabinet coordinating this exercise, which I think is an important model because there are many issues which do go across departments and agencies. The media had quite a positive role in this process. Sometimes the media likes to bag these kind of processes, but the advertiser got on board with this one and were quite positive and reported about the process as well as about the issue, which is really valuable. Apparently the chief editor's a keen cyclist, so that might have been a factor. And also there was a lot of public debate, particularly it came from the changes, and some of this wasn't all positive. There was quite a bit of argy-bargy, particularly about the footpaths ruling, and quite a bit of criticism of the citizens' jury as a result of that. But there's no doubt that the citizens' jury had quite a strong impact on that debate, and arguments from the jury came into the debate, and it was quite sort of central to that. So a very high impact project all round. Another thing I'm interested in with the project is something I call uptake. In this case, it's an uptake, not uptake of the recommendations, but uptake of this type of model, so the citizens' jury model, whether experience with the model influences people to use it more and to makes it more kind of accepted and legitimate. And there's quite a bit of evidence that this and the other citizens' juries have really given people confidence in using this as a tool in the South Australian Government. Okay, so going to the second case, which is quite a contrast. So this is the work that I did in government, and we ran this process on nanotechnology and informed choice in 2013. And we had a panel of 62 randomly selected residents of Sydney. They weren't terribly random. They were of an older age group, for example. And we had a multi-stakeholder working group helping us to design and run this engagement and providing a panel. And Lucy Calder-Liston worked with us to design and facilitate this process, and Lynn Carson was also on the working group. So we had some good talent. And Jetty Research did the recruiting. And I've got a question mark there for impact. It's interesting because the first case, I had nothing to do with the bikes citizens' jury. I was just looking at the impact of it. In this case, I helped to run it, but I didn't have an opportunity to look at the impact part because our program was closed soon after. And so I know much less about the impact of this one than I know about the impact of the other one. It proves to me how valuable impact assessment is in this type of work. You learn an enormous amount. But I can speculate. So the engagement went really well. Like I said, we had some talent, and the participants got heaps out of it. Some of them hadn't even heard of nanotechnology at the beginning, and they learnt a lot and they really engaged. And they were very keen at the end. They wanted to do more of this and keep doing this kind of work. The stakeholders who were there were also very impressed with the process. Whether it influenced their views, I can't say, but they were certainly influenced about this type of process and its value. In terms of influence in the empowered sphere, nothing direct. We didn't have a commitment to take up the recommendations, and so I really don't know how much influence it has had, but I'll tell you a bit of a story later if there's time about that. It's just something I don't know. But there were multiple agencies who were interested in the issue at the time when we ran it. There was no media that we were aware of that came out of it, which might not have been a bad thing. It's quite a hot topic, and this wasn't meant to be a kind of a high-profile event. And I don't suppose it influenced the public debate, except for people's friends and family who were participants. So in general, quite a low-impact project. So let's go back then to, and in terms of uptake, I think, again, it's not clear whether people thought, well, yeah, this is a great model. I don't think it's been taken up in the department since, but it didn't have a negative effect, which could happen on a sensitive topic like this. So I think that that's a good thing. So let's go back to this question then. So here we have a low impact process. So was it bad practice? No, I don't think it was bad practice. We had some great people and we won a Core Values Award. So I think we better say it was pretty good practice. And it was great. It was done really well. Were there factors that we weren't in control of? Absolutely, but they weren't that unpredictable. We kind of knew about them. Did we make a bad choice? Now this is the one that kept me awake at night. And Lynn Carson actually, when we were designing the thing, she said to me, have you got a commitment, a promise about the impact? And I said, no. And she said, well, why are we doing it? And that question stayed with me and has stayed with me, and it's informed quite a bit of this work. But I'll tell you a little story, and it's long enough ago that I can tell this. I talked to people in the department who were in different agencies who were interested in this issue at the time. And they said, oh yeah, it's a very interesting issue, yep, it's a hot topic, but it's sensitive, so you better talk to the minister's advisors. So I talked to the minister's advisor, and they said, yeah, that'd be pretty interesting, yep, that's a hot topic, yep, I think the minister would be interested in this, but we don't want our name on it. And the minister won't want anything to do with it. But you do it, and we'll be interested. Okay, that's as much of a commitment as we could get. But what that told me is that this could have influence. We wouldn't be able to measure it, but that it was worth doing. So I want to talk about one of the little ideas that I'm throwing in, which is that as engagement professionals, we need to be very flexible in our practice, and we need to be able to adapt to context. And we are not the ones who make the music. So we have to understand the acoustics of the spaces that we're working in, and we are actually the sound mixers. And we have a range of design parameters that we are mixing when we're doing engagement. So, and some of these, the best practice are kind of along the top. Okay, we want something as empowered as possible. We want it to be independent, so it'll have high legitimacy. We want citizens in there so that their voices can be heard. We want it to be highly resourced. And we want to use something like a citizens' jury because that's accepted and legitimate. But actually, I'm going to argue that we need to make these decisions about these parameters on the basis of the setting. So here's a couple of examples. We're in a local... Isn't that cool? We're in a local government setting, okay, so a relatively defined population. So we're going to be able to get a bunch of citizens who represent that community pretty well and who represent the discourses and the voices in the community. We think we can get that together. So we think that group can be empowered, and we've got a council that's on board, and so they're prepared to empower that group. So to have that kind of empowered process, we're going to need to have a lot of independence, so it has a lot of legitimacy. We have to make sure it's properly resourced. And we can use a citizens' jury model because that's got quite a bit of currency, people understand it, and it's got high legitimacy. So that should go well. We might talk about nuclear, for example. Okay, so here's another case. Let's say we're working at a national level. So that's what I was working in the department. We are not going to get a process empowered. Now, look, I say that, well, maybe there'll be a citizens' jury at some point about, I don't know, marriage equality or something where actually we can have a really high-profile process and, get everything in place to make it happen, maybe. But there's a lot of decisions that go on at federal level that could be influenced by engagement where we're just not going to get that empowerment. It's just not going to work and it's not a good idea. So in that context, maybe we're actually going to have more influence if we have an advisory process. It's not you have to take this on board, but hey, look, we can help you with this decision. We know that you've got a lot of things to take into account, but this engagement process will give you some insights that will help with your decision. If it's not going to be empowered, then we don't need to have that independence, that legitimacy. We can make it more embedded in the situation so that we have more resonance with the political debate that's going on. Let's do that. In that case, we had better involve some stakeholders as well as publics because they have a high stake in this. And it also means we don't need the resources, perhaps. And remember that, particularly at high levels of government, resourcing is also about the stakes and the profile. And sometimes we want lower profile processes to have these impacts. And we can't have a citizens' jury, that's not what it's going to look like, so we're going to need a flexible design to fit this context that we've got. And you can imagine using this in different ways, in different situations, when we're constrained, using this model in a sort of, in an intelligent way. So, the last thing I want to say, and I'll try and get through this quickly, is I think one of the biggest issues that we have in this practice is marginalisation, and Anne's talked about this a lot, is that engagement is separate from decision making and it's marginalised. And I think there's a real issue here with professionalisation, because professionalisation can send the message that engagement professionals will take care of it. And that's what I got in the department. Wendy's managing the stakeholders, she's doing a great job. Okay. What I think we need is integration across this whole spectrum, and that's maybe where the spectrum sits there, and impact across that spectrum, not only on the participants, but in the wider public sphere, in the influential orbit, and in the empowered sphere, and a culture shift where, in all of these areas, people really look to these sort of processes to help. So politicians will look to them to help with difficult policy problems. That media and stakeholders in the influential orbit see these as important channels to government and get on board with them because of that. And where members of the wider public don't think, that's not what I think, or I wasn't there, you know, who do they think they are, but think, I haven't had a chance to read about this issue, but there's a citizens' jury, so that should give me really interesting information about it. So I think we need that culture shift, and I don't think best practice is going to do it. I think what we need is adaptive, collaborative, integrative, iterative practice, but as that's not very catchy, I've coined the term best we can practice, which describes this kind of practice where we work within our context and with the people who are actually doing the engagement in this complex environment. And I'm happy to talk more about best we can engagement. So, thank you very much.
Well, pretty impressive. Do you know you've even got like 5 minutes for questions? Would you
Sorry,
take
wasn't 10? I would, absolutely.
Fabulous.
Or just comments as from...
Oh, just comments. That could take a lot longer. So if you've got a burning question, or you need 30 seconds with the people you're chatting, sitting next to. Okay, I'm generous woman. 30 seconds with the person you're sitting next to about what's your burning reflection, question, or just fun. Woohoo! I've always thought of myself as a sound engineer at the moment. So chat to the people next to you. That'll give Wendy a moment to have a glass of water. Okay. Alrighty, it's that sort of game where I stop, a question will remain. Oh no, you got very quiet, didn't you? Oh no, go back to the middle of the room. And oh no, note-taking over here. We're buying rubbish. And hello, how are you? You are?
Barbara. We met a couple of years ago in Melbourne. That's right.
Everybody else knows you, Barbara. Barbara, do you have a question or a comment or a reflection?
As a sort of comment, I suppose, we were just saying that, you know, it does reflect quite a bit of what we've done. It is really difficult to get far less the politicians, but those higher up the line within the organisations, particularly in, as somebody earlier said, the hard infrastructure area, actually accepting of the value of people whose lives were affecting, having a part within the decision-making of it. I think they're very scared of it. I do like we were just saying just now, we like the little sound diagram there, because also engaging within the organisation, they want a toolkit, they want, you know, they want a policy, they want a framework, but they don't want lots of words, they want things that they can relate to easily, and the visual actually does that, and it makes it logical to them.
Did anybody else like the sound engineer? Should we give some feedback? Okay, we're going to do it with hands and voice. So, because it's sound engineer. Okay, so if you like the sound engineer, pop a hand into the air and go woohoo. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Did you get it? Okay, you didn't have a little C on it, so we're going to steal it now. Another comment or question? Oh, coming over this way. Yes, I'm a woman who can run fast, you can tell. Hello, how are you? Clear, go.
In regards to the soundboard, I was just interested that you had standard practice at the top and tailored at the bottom, because I think when you look at context, you have to go through all of that, look at what your context is, and then you tailor your design. And so I don't agree with that. Sorry.
Okay, bring it on down, Wendy.
Yeah, no, great point. And I had mixed feelings about that. And I've actually had a debate which I haven't had properly with Lars Kluver from the Danish Board of Technology about this, because he's very into very established methods. And I think there is a place for established methods in relation to legitimacy and kind of currency, and giving not only a structure to the method, but something that people can be happy with, particularly for decision makers and so on. But I'm very much into the tailored sort of flexible approach, and I think this is something that we need, particularly in the deliberative democracy field, is we need a lot more design flexibility, I think. And the citizens' jury model's getting a bit fixed and a bit off the shelf. And yeah, when tenders start to come out saying, we want a citizens' jury on blah, then there's a problem. Yeah, we've started with the tool, yeah. So no, I'm inclined to agree.
Fantastic. I've got a question here and then, of course, one over the other side of the room. So your question will be short, your answer will be slightly longer, and I will get there.
Wendy, you raised the issue of professionalisation, and I share with you the concern that as a profession we basically evolve into cleaners of other people's messes, and that's how we're viewed internally. The challenge, of course, is with decision makers, to get them to actually see us as more than cleaners and as people that can actually feed things into their decision-making processes, and we end up with an improved decision as a consequence. What's your, I suppose, experience, recommendation in that space? We need to move beyond the issue that you've identified. Are you starting to address that? Are you any experience in that space?
Don't forget, long answer.
Okay. Oh, no, I couldn't really speak from personal experience. I mean, I think this has got to happen on multiple kind of fronts. I think the iterative adjective is important in that, both for decision makers but also for practitioners, that we have to be constantly kind of learning but also constantly kind of going back, moving away from this kind of one-off engagement event kind of approach, if we can, and developing ongoing sort of relationships and so on. And I think in some of the organisations where engagements become really embedded, and I don't know if it's chicken or egg, the engagement practitioners play a more meta role in providing kind of advice and oversight, and are people that decision makers can go to, rather than people who do the engagement kind of work. And like I say, I don't know if that's what emerges once an organisation has taken on it, has engagement embedded, or whether having that as a model helps with that process. I suspect it's a bit of both.
Thanks, Wendy. And the maybe last question, unless there's another one, is from Jessica from Canterbury.
Hi, I actually was going to pretty much ask the same type of question as the one that's just had, and so thank you for your answer. I guess what I'm hearing today, and I heard yesterday, was that tension between us as becoming professional, having the professionalisation of what we do, and us becoming specialists and was it the clean-up crew you called us? And that sort of general understanding of engagement and how engagement works in the organisations that we work in. And certainly within my role in emergency management, we really have that tension in terms of being able to communicate to people, engineers and scientists, who don't naturally sit in this space. This is actually a discipline, and we have some thinking in behind why we do what we do and why we do it this way, versus them thinking that it's something that's actually quite easy and they can go out and do it without having that thought process sitting behind our role, sitting back in that slightly removed space. So thank you for articulating that. We're not necessarily the doers, but we sit around that Sorry, there's not a question in there, but
That's okay.
yeah, thank you.
If I might make a comment anyway, I think one of the useful shifts is also to shift our attention away from publics and from engaging with publics to thinking about decision making. And decision making, political decision making is incredibly complex, and I think we need to develop our understanding of that to know how this practice fits in, how it can integrate.
Wendy, can you take one more?
Again, sorry, it's another comment. I'm actually a councillor from the City of Melbourne. That's not the hat I'm technically wearing today. But the People's Panel, I think the reason why a lot of the decisions were actually accepted by council unanimously was because the decision makers, us, we were involved in the process right from the beginning, and understanding the actual, the process that was undertaken for the People's Panel was really key to us actually supporting it along the way.
Any other final questions as I wander back to Wendy? Oh, of course. Hello, how are you? Loved your presentation this morning, by the way. I wasn't depressed at all. Mind you, I do have sort of a black hat. Simon.
Thank you. I was really struck by the point that the editor of the newspaper was a keen cyclist, and that I suspect that meant that he understood that it was a complex conversation. And I wonder whether, where we have the choices, who in that, what did you call it, the sphere around the influential sphere, who do we need to understand participatory democracy? What are they interested in? Let's do it on that issue. But begin to get smart politically about who needs to help us change the system. Let's pick more editors who are interested in perhaps niche issues.
Yeah. Well, and it's probably worth saying on that point too that the framing of that citizens' jury had quite an effect too on its impact, because it wasn't bikes against cars, it was sharing the road safely, it was recognising that most people who ride a bike also have a car and so on, and so it opened up that issue as well. Yeah.